process begins when we sculpt an original. Cynthia, for example, sculpted this bird out of wax. And then I'll take this master here and put it inside this frame, sandwich the frame on either side with these plastic plates, and pour a clear silicone into it. A few hours later, when the silicone melts, you have this right here, which is a mold of that bird that's now been cut open, so that when we push it up against the wax pot that has molten wax and air pressure, the mold fills in. And then when the piece sets, we'll pull it out and attach it to a casting tree. So now that the tree is done, it's ready to be cast. First, we have to weigh it to find out how much metal we need. I take the base and turn it this way to see what I've written on the side, which is 125. That tells me that the base itself weighs 125 grams. By moving these around here on the triple beam, I can determine that the weight of the entire structure is 136.5 minus 125 is 11.5. The specific gravity of silver is 10.4. which gives us 120. So I will weigh out 120 grams of metal to use for my casting. So we've got the cylinder around the wax, and we're ready to invest the plaster. So we take our little mixing bowl, and we pour our cup of water in there, and then we come over and we take 2 cups of investing plaster. We add that in there, and when we're done with that, we mix it up as fast as we possibly can because we have a very little amount of time. It takes about 11 to 12 minutes before it sets into solid hard rock. Take the plaster in here and we put the casting bubble over it. We then turn on the vacuum and it gives about 25 pounds of pressure that sucks the air out of the plaster. The level of the plaster will rise as the bubbles are sucked out, and at one point it will collapse back down. Once it's collapsed, that's a sign that you're done vacuuming the plaster. So then you take that out, and as quickly as you can, you very slowly pour the plaster down the inner wall of the flask. And then once you have the entire flask completely filled, you set it back in your vacuum, and you vacuum it again. So once you're done with the vacuuming, you leave it set for about another 8 or 9 minutes before it's hard, and then you can transport it. But it takes about another hour before it's hard enough and the liquid is evaporated enough for it to be able to go into the kiln. So once the flask had set, the plaster had set, we put it inside the kiln and burned it out for about 6 or 7 hours at 1250. Once the burnout's done, we're going to check and see if it's ready to cast. And what we're looking for here on the opening at the bottom of the flask is a nice cherry red interior, which this one appears to have. It's also really nice and white on top, which means all of the carbon has burned away. So it's time to go. We're going to turn it upside down, put it back in face up with the opening of the flask facing the heating element, so it's really hot when the metal enters and has time to make it into the entire mold. All right, so the flask is in the kiln and it's ready to go. So we're going to start up the casting. This is the centrifuge arm that's spring-loaded that will sling the metal into the flask. So I'm going to wind this up 3 times. 1, 2, 3, and set it with this little pin that prevents it from spinning on me. This is what we're going to use to heat up the crucible. Now that the environment is good and hot, I'm going to start adding metal to it. I'm going to slowly heat up this metal. Okay, so now the first part of the metal is melted down. We're going to add the second part of the metal. So now the metal is melted. We're ready to get the flask and finish it up. And we are ready to keep the flame on it, to keep it hot. It's been slinging for long enough, the metals, if it's in there, it's in there. And if not, then there's nothing to do about it now. I start slowing it down. So it's slow enough to pull it out. And this is what's called a button. This was that extra 10 grams that we added when we weighed it in order to give it the extra heat that it needs while it's setting inside the centrifuge. That's an absolutely perfect button. That's a good sign that it was a successful casting. All right, so you reach in and pull out your metal piece. It looks pretty good. Now I'm going to take it over with my high-pressure hose and blow all the plaster off so that I can get into the rods that are now metal and snip those off so that I can grind down the ends and start making them look like finished pieces. Cleaned up and ready to snip. I'm going to take this snipping tool and chop it off here right underneath the bird's belly. There's going to be a little bit of a snipping mark there that we're going to have to take to the grinding stone and smooth off. So now that this piece is relatively cleaned off, I'm going to snip off the little extra piece that was on here. And then using the grinding wheel to match the shape of those little marks in the sculpture. To try to hide where the gate was, a little sprue. And that looks pretty nice there. And I use this brush to get all of the plaster and stuff off of it. So once the piece has been brushed off and has gone through the pickling and tumbling process, we bring it over to the buffing wheel. We're going to put a little bit of this buffing compound on here to make the cut good and sharp so that it's shiny when it's finished. And apply this final buff to it, which takes off the oxidation and burnishes down the surface. And there we have it. A finished, polished piece, ready to go on a necklace near you.